340 people were standing along the riverbank at Millhaven Lock on a Tuesday morning in September of 2019, and most of them had already made up their minds about the woman backing the rust-streaked crane into position at the far end of the staging area. The Illinois Highway Commission had been working that site for 11 days. 11 days of diesel fumes and radio traffic and official vehicles with magnetic door signs. 11 days of a 40-ton hydraulic gantry crane from a Chicago-based rigging firm sitting idle on a gravel pad because the numbers kept coming back wrong, because the silt had packed around the base of that fallen lock gate in ways that the load calculations hadn't anticipated, because the thing that was supposed to be a 3-day extraction job had turned into a public embarrassment that was starting to attract journalists and state legislators and questions about the contract. The commission's lead contractor had a $2 million rig on site. He had a crew of 9. He had a project manager who wore a company polo shirt with the firm's logo embroidered above the heart, and who carried a tablet computer and spoke the language of load factors and critical lift plans and certified rigging engineers. What he did not have was 265 feet of the Millhaven River navigational channel, which remained blocked by a 63-year-old steel lock gate that had separated from its hinges during a flood event the previous spring and settled into the riverbed at an angle that made every modern approach to moving it geometrically complicated in ways that kept changing every time they thought they'd solved it. The woman in the cab of the 1956 Manitowoc 4100 was named Darlene Purcell. She was 51 years old. She ran a small crane and rigging operation out of a gravel yard on County Road 14 in Hardin County, 40 miles south, and she had driven that crane to Millhaven on a lowboy trailer behind a truck that had 280,000 miles on it. And she had arrived at 6 in the morning and set up without ceremony and without a crew, because she didn't bring a crew, and she had done the rigging herself in the gray pre-dawn while the commission's 9-man team stood near their coffee and watched. The project manager looked at the Manitowoc 4100 the way a surgeon looks at a butter knife someone has placed on the instrument tray. He said something to the man standing next to him. The man next to him laughed. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because without it, the rest of this story is just a woman lifting a heavy thing, and that is not what this story is. Let me tell you about Darlene Purcell, because without knowing who she is and where she came from and what she spent 30 years learning in a gravel yard in Hardin County, you cannot understand what happened on that riverbank, and you cannot understand why the people who watched it happen still talk about it the way they do. Darlene was born in 1968 in Rosaclair, Illinois, which is a small town on the Ohio River in Hardin County, in the kind of geography that the rest of the state tends to forget exists. River bottom country, limestone bluffs, old fluorspar mining operations that had been shutting down since the 1960s, a county where the economy had been in a slow contraction for longer than most of its residents had been alive. Her father, Gerald Purcell, ran a small excavation and crane service. Not a large operation, never more than 3 or 4 pieces of equipment, a couple of hired hands in the good years, just Gerald and his brother in the lean ones. He did bridge work, river work, salvage, whatever came through. He had a reputation in 3 counties for being able to move things that other people had looked at and walked away from. Gerald Purcell did not have a daughter who was going to sit in the house. That was simply not how it worked. By the time Darlene was 9 years old, she was handing him tools. By 12, she was reading load charts. By 15, she was in the cab of a Manitowoc 3900 under his supervision, learning the feel of a machine that communicated through vibration and resistance and sound in ways that the charts and tables could describe but never fully capture. Gerald had a phrase he used when she would ask him how he knew something, how he knew the ground was going to hold, how he knew the angle was right, how he knew the rigging was going to behave the way he said it would. He would put his hand flat on the side of the machine and he would say, "You listen to it until it tells you." She listened. Gerald Purcell died in 1998 of a heart attack in the gravel yard on County Road 14. He was 62. He had not been sick. He had been under a crane the morning it happened, checking a bearing, and he had come out from under it and sat down against the tire, and that was where Darlene found him when she came out with lunch. The crane business passed to her in its entirety because her brother had moved to Indianapolis in 1994 and had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with Hardin County or heavy equipment, and her mother had passed 4 years before Gerald, and there was no one else. She was 30 years old. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Cora. She had a gravel yard, a shop building, 2 pieces of equipment, and a business that had no name on paper, because Gerald had always operated on handshake and reputation and had never seen the need to formalize it. She named it Purcell Crane and Rigging. She got the paperwork done at the county clerk's office on a Wednesday afternoon and was back in the yard by 3 o'clock. Here's what I want you to understand about the next 21 years. She did not grow the business dramatically. She did not expand into new markets or hire a sales team or rebrand. She bought equipment when she found the right piece at the right price, and she turned down work that didn't suit her, and she kept her overhead low enough that she could survive the slow years. And there were slow years. There were years where Hardin County and the surrounding counties didn't generate enough crane work to keep the lights on without supplementing with other things. Rigging jobs, equipment moves, a few years where she drove a lowboy for a quarry operation just to keep cash coming in. She raised Cora. She kept the shop. She paid off the property Gerald had mortgaged in 1991 in full by 2007. And she has not carried debt since. What she did grow was knowledge. She became, over those 21 years, one of the most deeply knowledgeable people in a 3-state region on the subject of cable crane rigging, on the behavior of lattice boom cranes under eccentric loading, on river and waterway work specifically, the way silt behaves, the way submerged objects distribute load differently than their above-grade weight suggests, the way current and bed composition affect what a crane can and cannot do from a given position. She had learned most of this from Gerald, and she had extended it through her own work and through a habit of study that her daughter Cora described once as, "My mother reads crane manuals the way other people read novels." She had, at the time of the Millhaven job, 4 cranes in her yard. The Manitowoc 4100 was the oldest and the one she had rebuilt most completely. Now, I need to tell you about the 4100, because this is the intellectual key to everything that happened on that riverbank, and I need you to stay with me for a few minutes because this part matters. The Manitowoc 4100 is a lattice boom crane that was manufactured beginning in the early 1950s. It is a crawler crane. It moves on steel tracks, and it is what the industry calls a duty cycle machine, meaning it was designed not just for single critical lifts, but for repetitive, heavy work. Clamshell excavation, drag lane operation, pile driving, the kind of sustained mechanical labor that requires a machine to work hard for long periods, without the precision engineering tolerances of a modern lift crane. The 4100 was built for durability and for versatility. It was built for river and waterway work, for soft ground, for the kind of job sites that modern cranes with their high ground-bearing pressure requirements simply cannot access. Here is what the 4100 has that modern hydraulic cranes do not: a lattice boom, a structural steel framework that distributes load along its length rather than concentrating it at a single pivot point, gives the machine a lift characteristic that behaves differently under eccentric and angular loading than a modern hydraulic boom does. When you're lifting an object that is not hanging cleanly vertical, when you're lifting something that has resistance at the base, something that is suctioned into silt, something that needs to be walked or pivoted rather than simply lifted straight up, a lattice boom crane with the right rigging geometry can apply force in ways that a hydraulic crane with a telescoping boom fundamentally cannot replicate. The force is not just vertical, it is directional. It is controllable through the boom angle and the load line position in ways that give an experienced operator a degree of mechanical nuance that modern equipment, for all its power and precision instrumentation, does not offer. Darlene Purcell had rebuilt the 4100's hoist drums. She had replaced the wire rope with a specific construction, a rotation-resistant rope with a particular lay that she had specified herself based on the kind of work she did. She had rebuilt the swing mechanism. She had modified the boom foot to accept a specific attachment that her father had fabricated in 1979 and that she had maintained ever since. A piece of equipment that existed nowhere in any catalog, that had no part number, that was just a steel assembly built by a man who understood a problem and solved it with a welder and 30 years of experience. The Fallen Lock Gate at Millhaven was 62 feet long and weighed approximately 41 tons. It had settled at an angle of roughly 17 degrees from vertical, base down, with its lower edge buried in approximately 4 feet of compacted river silt. The silt suction, the adhesive force created by fine sediment packing around a submerged object, was the problem that had defeated the commission's contractor. Every calculation of the gate's weight assumed a clean vertical lift. The silt was adding a resistance force that the hydraulic crane's load management system was interpreting as an overload condition, triggering automatic shutdowns before the gate broke free of the bed. The contractor had tried rigging from multiple angles. He had tried water jetting to break the suction seal. He had tried a combination lift with a second crane. None of it had worked cleanly, and after 11 days, the commission was out of approved approaches and the channel was still blocked. Darlene had looked at the site survey and the dive reports for 3 days before she called the commission's project office. She had not called to pitch her services. She had called to ask 2 specific questions about the gate's geometry and the bed composition at the base. The project manager had answered the questions somewhat impatiently and had asked why she was calling. She told him she thought she could move it. He had paused for a moment and then said, with the particular courtesy of a man who does not want to be rude to someone he has already dismissed, that the job was under contract and that the contractor was continuing to work the problem. She said she understood that. She said she'd be there Tuesday. The commission, by that point, was willing to let anyone try, the morning of the pull, and I use that word deliberately because what Darlene was going to do was not strictly a lift, and that distinction is the entire story. The temperature was 64 degrees, and the river was running at a moderate stage, clear enough to see 2 feet down into the green water near the bank. The staging area was a gravel pad that the commission had laid on the north bank, and the Manitowoc 4100 was positioned at an angle to the gate that made no immediate sense to anyone watching who was accustomed to thinking about cranes as machines that lift things straight up. The project manager walked over to her as she was completing her rigging inspection. He looked at the boom angle. He looked at the position of the load line relative to the gate. He said, with genuine professional concern rather than dismissal, he had moved past dismissal by this point. 11 days had taken it out of him. He said he didn't understand the geometry. He said the load line wasn't over the center of gravity. Darlene did not look up from the rigging. She said, "It's not supposed to be." She put her hand flat on the side of the 4100's lower works, the way her father had taught her, and then she climbed into the cab. The crowd on the riverbank had grown through the morning. The commission's crew was there. A small number of journalists, several people from the town of Mill Haven itself, which had been watching this operation for 11 days, with the particular mix of frustration and dark entertainment that a public works failure generates in a small community. There were people standing on the bridge upstream. There were people on the opposite bank. At 9:47 in the morning, Darlene Purcell started the Manitowoc 4100. I want you to understand what that sounds like because it matters. A 1956 Manitowoc 4100 does not start the way a modern crane starts. It does not turn over with the subdued whir of a modern diesel coming up to operating temperature. It starts the way something old and serious starts, with a sound that begins deep in the machine and builds through registers that you feel in your sternum before you hear them clearly. A mechanical voice that has been saying the same thing for 63 years and has not changed its mind about any of it. The crowd on the bank heard it. The commission's crew heard it. The project manager, standing 30 feet away with his tablet, heard it. And he did something he had probably not done in a professional context in some years. He put the tablet down. The 4100 sat at operating temperature for 4 minutes. Darlene did not rush this. She checked her instruments. She made one small adjustment to the boom angle, a correction of perhaps 2 degrees that took 45 seconds. And then she brought the load line down to the rigging she had set on the gate. The chain went tight. Not the chain, the wire rope, but the moment is the same. The moment when the slack comes out and the rope goes from hanging in a gentle curve to a straight line carrying force, and you hear the single sharp note of it, like a plucked string the size of a ship's cable, and everything that follows is consequence. She did not try to lift the gate. This is what nobody on that bank understood at first, and what I need you to understand now. She did not try to lift it. She applied tension at an angle, a specific angle, calculated over 3 days of looking at survey data and dive reports, that was designed not to pull the gate up, but to rotate it. To use the load line as a lever arm, with the base of the gate as the fulcrum, to rock the lower edge of the gate in the silt. Not to overcome the suction all at once, the way you would in a straight vertical lift, but to break it progressively, the way you work a fence post out of frozen ground. Not by pulling straight up, but by working it back and forth until the grip of the earth releases. The 4100 applied tension. The gate did not move. The crowd was quiet. The 4100 held tension. Darlene held tension. 60 seconds. 90 seconds. The wire rope was taut enough to sing in the light river wind, a low harmonic that people standing near the bank described afterward as something between a musical note and a warning. At approximately the 2-minute mark, something changed. It was not visible at first. It was audible. A low, wet, percussive sound from below the waterline, the sound of silt releasing its grip on steel, the sound of 4 feet of compacted river bottom deciding, after 11 days of resistance, that it had held long enough. The gate moved, not up, sideways and rotational, the base pivoting in the silt the way Darlene had calculated it would, the lower edge breaking free of the suction seal and beginning to describe an arc through the riverbed. The crowd heard it before they saw it. Then they saw it. The top of the gate, the portion that had been angled toward the surface, began to rise. Slowly. The way a draft horse leans into a collar and the load begins to move, not with drama, not with the sudden lurch of something overcome by brute force, but with the quiet inevitability of a force that has been correctly applied and cannot now be stopped. The 4100's engine note changed, deepened, settled into a register that was not strain but commitment, the sound of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do and finding no reason to complain about it. Darlene adjusted the boom angle by a fraction. The movement was so small that people watching from the bank could not see it. They could only see its effect, which was that the gate's rotation accelerated slightly, the arc of the base through the silt widening, the top rising with increasing authority. At the 3-minute and 40-second mark from first tension, the lock gate broke the surface. The sound from the crowd was not a cheer. Not immediately. It was the sound of a large group of people exhaling at the same moment, a collective release of breath that had been held without anyone deciding to hold it, followed by a silence of perhaps 3 seconds, in which the only sounds were the Manitowoc's engine and the water running off 62 feet of steel that had not seen daylight since the previous spring. Then the cheer. Darlene did not stop. She had the gate free of the bed, but she was not done. She needed to swing it to the staging area on the bank, and she did this with the same unhurried precision she had used throughout. The 4100's swing mechanism carrying the gate in a controlled arc, the load line adjusting as she went, the whole movement taking another 6 minutes from surface break to the moment the gate touched the gravel pad on the north bank, and she eased the tension out of the rope. The gate was down. She sat in the cab for a moment after she cut the tension. Just a moment. Then she climbed out, and she walked to the rigging, and she began her post-lift inspection the way she always did, checking the wire rope for damage, checking the hook block, checking the rigging points on the gate. She did this before she spoke to anyone. She did this before she acknowledged the crowd. She did this because it was the correct thing to do, and because it was what her father had taught her, and because in 30 years of crane work she had never skipped a post-lift inspection, and she was not going to start now. The project manager came to her while she was coiling a sling. He stood there for a moment. He was a professional man, and he had the professional man's difficulty with the specific situation of having been wrong in a way that was witnessed by 300 people. He said, "I need to understand the geometry." He said it quietly, without the tablet, without the company Polo's authority behind it. He said it the way someone asks a question when they actually want the answer. Darlene finished coiling the sling. She said, "The suction load was never the problem. The geometry was the problem. You were fighting it straight up. You needed to break the seal before you lifted, and you can't do that with a hydraulic boom because the load management system won't let you apply the angular force you need. It sees it as an overload because it is an overload for that kind of lift. It's not an overload for this kind of lift," she said. "This machine doesn't have a computer telling it what it can't do. It has me telling it what it can." The project manager looked at the 4100 for a moment. He said, "How old is that crane?" she said. 63 years. He nodded once. He walked back to his crew, one of the younger men on the commission crew. He couldn't have been more than 24, 25. Waited until the project manager was out of earshot and came over to where Darlene was still working through her post-lift check. He asked her about the boom angle calculation. He asked specifically about how she had determined the rotational arc of the gate in the silt. He had a notebook. He was writing things down. She answered every question. Cora Purcell had driven up from Rosiclare that morning. She had not told her mother she was coming. She had parked on the bridge road upstream and watched the whole thing from a distance. The way you watch something that belongs to you without wanting to interrupt it. She was 28 years old, and she was, at that point, 3 months into her crane operator's apprenticeship, working under her mother in the gravel yard on County Road 14. She had grown up watching Darlene work. She had grown up in the shop, handing tools, reading charts, learning to listen to machines the way her grandfather had taught her mother to listen to them. After the gate was down and the crowd had thinned and Darlene had finished her inspection, Cora walked over. Darlene saw her coming from 20 yards away and did not say anything until Cora was standing next to her. Then she said, "You drove up." Cora said, "I wanted to see it." Darlene put her hand on the side of the 4100, flat, the way Gerald had always done it, and she said, "You'll do one harder than this someday." They drove back to Hardin County that afternoon. Darlene on the lowboy with the 4100, Cora following in the truck. 40 miles of two-lane highway through river-bottom country, limestone bluffs, the kind of geography the rest of the state tends to forget exists. The Manitowoc 4100 is still in the yard on County Road 14. It sits between a 1968 American 7260 and a newer link belt that Darlene bought in 2021, and it does not look like a machine that cleared a blocked navigational channel after 11 days of failure by a $2 million modern rig. It looks like what it is, a 68-year-old crane that has been used hard and maintained carefully and rebuilt where it needed rebuilding and never painted to look like something it isn't. The rust on the upper works is original. The boom is the same boom Gerald Purcell bought with the machine in 1971. Repaired in several places, but not replaced. The attachment at the boom foot, the one Gerald fabricated in 1979, the one with no part number, the one that exists nowhere in any catalog, is still there. Darlene still runs the yard. Cora works alongside her now, full ticket, 3 years into her own reputation in the river counties. On Tuesday mornings, when the work allows it, they go over load charts together at the workbench in the shop, the same workbench where Gerald used to sit, under the same fluorescent light that has been replaced twice, but has hung in the same position since 1984. Darlene still reads crane manuals. She still does her own rigging. She still puts her hand flat on the side of a machine before she climbs into the cab. The ground doesn't lie. Silt doesn't care what something cost. It holds until something understands it well enough to ask it to let go. If that story found something in you, if you've watched someone apply the right kind of force while everyone else was applying the wrong kind, if you know a woman or a man who learned something so completely that the machines talk back, drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I mean that. The stories that come through the comments on this channel are some of the best ones I've found, and more than a few of them have become videos. Every week on this channel, there's another story about someone who did the quiet work, who built the knowledge over decades, who showed up with the right answer when the expensive answer had run out of ideas. If that's worth something to you, subscribe. Not for the algorithm, because there are more of these stories and they deserve to be told carefully. And if this one meant something, pass it on. Stories like this don't survive unless somebody carries them forward. Darlene Purcell's father taught her something in a gravel yard in Hardin County, and she carried it 40 miles upriver on a Tuesday morning in September and set it down on a gravel pad in front of 300 people. And now you know it too. That's how it works. That's always how it works.